John Keller lived in a small, quiet town in Texas where the air smelled of pine and dust, and where mornings were slow and peaceful. His house sat at the edge of the road, a small wooden place surrounded by open fields. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough for him. He didn't need much these days, just peace and the steady company of his dog, Ranger. Ranger was a large German shepherd with bright eyes and a calm spirit. To anyone else, he was just a loyal pet, but to John, he was family. They had been through a lot together, though few people knew just how much. When John adopted Ranger from a rescue shelter 5 years earlier, he hadn't planned on forming such a bond. The dog had been wary of people, quiet but alert, watching every movement as if deciding whether to trust again. John understood that feeling better than most. He too was learning how to live in peace after a lifetime of chaos. John had served for over 20 years in the military, a part of a group few even knew existed. He had traveled across deserts, mountains, and war zones, often under the cover of night doing things that were never spoken about in the open. It had changed him in ways he didn't always like to admit. The world he came from was made of discipline, silence, and sacrifice. Coming home to a quiet life wasn't easy. For years, he carried the weight of memories he didn't want to remember. But Ranger helped him in ways no human could. Every morning started the same way. The sound of birds, the smell of coffee, and the steady click of Ranger's paws on the wooden floor. John would pour himself a cup, open the door, and let Ranger run across the yard, chasing the cool morning air. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and while most people liked John, few really knew him. He was polite, calm, and always willing to lend a hand. If someone's fence needed fixing, he'd show up with tools. If an old neighbor needed groceries carried, he'd do it without being asked. He didn't talk much, but his quiet presence spoke for him. The locals sometimes wondered about his past. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he looked at things, measured, calm, steady. He didn't move like other men his age. He moved with purpose, like every motion was trained. Kids in the neighborhood called him the soldier man, though no one really knew what he had done in the service. He never talked about it, and no one pressed. Small towns had a way of respecting silence. For John, the routine was everything. It gave him a sense of balance. He woke at dawn, took Ranger for a long walk down the dirt road, and waved at the few cars that passed by. Sometimes he stopped by the diner for breakfast and black coffee, eggs, and toast. The waitress, an older woman named Linda, always smiled when she saw him. "Morning, John, the usual?" she'd ask. He'd nod, smile softly, and say, "You know me too well." Ranger would wait patiently outside, sitting near the window so he could keep an eye on John. People adored the dog. Kids would pet him, and he'd wag his tail gently, careful not to frighten anyone. He had a calm presence just like his owner. Despite the peace, there were nights when John would wake in the dark, heart racing, his mind trapped in old memories. He'd get up quietly, step outside, and sit on the porch, letting the wind cool his face. Ranger would follow, sitting close, resting his head on John's leg. No words were ever needed. The dog somehow knew. The two of them would stay there until the first light of dawn touched the fields. Over time, John started doing small handyman work around town. It wasn't about the money, it was about staying busy, fixing roofs, repairing old fences, building sheds. He enjoyed working with his hands. It reminded him that he could still create, not just destroy. People appreciated him for that, not just for his skills, but for his kindness. He never asked for payment right away, and if someone couldn't afford it, he'd simply say, "Pay me when you can." There was a calm rhythm to his days. Life for once felt manageable. Sometimes he'd sit by the lake at sunset, throwing small stones into the water, watching the ripples fade. Ranger would lie beside him, eyes half closed, tail swaying slowly. These were the moments John cherished. The silence, the stillness, the feeling that maybe finally he was home. But deep down, a small part of him still carried the soldier's instinct. It wasn't something he could turn off. He noticed everything. The angle of parked cars, the movement of shadows, the sound of footsteps. It wasn't paranoia. It was awareness. Years of training had taught him to see things others missed. Sometimes that instinct comforted him. Other times it reminded him that the world could change in an instant. One Sunday afternoon, John was out in the yard fixing a section of the fence that had been knocked down by a storm. Ranger was nearby, trotting along the property line, sniffing the grass and occasionally stopping to bark at a squirrel. It was a peaceful day, warm and quiet, the kind of day that made life feel simple again. A few of the neighborhood kids rode their bikes down the street, waving as they passed. "Hey, Mr. Keller," they called. John waved back, smiling faintly. He didn't know that in just a few days, that peace would be broken in a way he could never have imagined. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John grilled some chicken in the backyard. He ate on the porch, Ranger sitting beside him, waiting for scraps. The radio played softly, old country songs that brought a sense of calm. He liked the simple things now, the smell of smoke, the sound of crickets, the slow rhythm of life. After dinner, he cleaned up, gave Ranger a treat, and sat by the fire pit staring into the flames. He thought about his old team sometimes, the men he'd served with. Some of them were gone, others scattered across the country, each trying to build a life after service. He missed the camaraderie, the trust that came with working side by side in impossible situations. Civilian life felt different, quieter, yes, but also lonelier. People didn't understand what it meant to live on edge for so long. Ranger did, though. The dog had been his anchor, keeping him grounded when his thoughts tried to pull him under. Later that night, as he locked up the house, he paused by the window and looked out at the yard. Ranger was curled up on the porch, half asleep but alert enough to lift his head at the slightest sound. John smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. That dog had saved him more than once, might, not from bullets or enemies, but from himself. The next morning he woke early, as always. The air was cool, the kind that hinted at rain. He brewed coffee, leashed Ranger, and started their usual walk down the road. The world was still half asleep. Only the sound of wind and distant roosters filled the air. John liked it that way. He nodded to a passing mail truck, waved to a farmer driving a tractor, and kept walking. Ranger trotted beside him, tail wagging. Halfway through the walk, they stopped by a small field. John picked up a stick and threw it. Ranger darted after it, leaping through the tall grass. When he returned, his mouth full of dirt and joy, John laughed. A real laugh, one that came from the heart. Moments like that made him feel alive again. When they got back home, John sat on the porch with his coffee while Ranger drank from his bowl. The morning felt perfect. Calm. Ordinary. He couldn't have known that a single misunderstanding would soon turn this calm life into chaos. But for now, there was only peace. That afternoon, John drove into town for supplies. He stopped by the hardware store to pick up nails and wood for another small project he was working on, rebuilding an old shed behind his house. The store owner, a friendly man named Robert, greeted him warmly. "You're keeping busy, huh, John?" he said. John smiled. "Trying to," he replied. "It helps the days go by," Robert nodded. "That's good. Not many folks can work with their hands like you anymore." John just shrugged. "It's what I know." After that, he stopped by the diner again. Linda poured him a cup of coffee before he even sat down. "You look tired," she said kindly. "Long week?" He chuckled softly. "Just been fixing things. That's all I do these days." "Well, that's better than breaking things," she said with a wink. He smiled at that, a quiet smile that held both truth and sadness. By the time he got home, the sky was turning gray. A storm was rolling in from the west, wind picking up dust across the fields. Ranger greeted him at the door, tail wagging, ready for play. "Not today, buddy," John said gently. "Storm's coming. Let's stay in." The rain started just after dark. Heavy drops hit the roof, thunder rumbling in the distance. John sat by the window, watching lightning streak across the sky. Ranger lay beside his feet, occasionally lifting his head at the sound. It reminded John of nights overseas, when storms would roll over the desert, lighting up the horizon. But here it wasn't fear that filled him, it was comfort. This was home. Later that night, when the storm eased, John stepped outside one last time. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. He looked up at the sky, at the faint glow of stars pushing through the clouds. Ranger stood beside him, silent. For a brief moment, everything felt right. The world, though imperfect, was at peace in that quiet corner of Texas. John had no way of knowing that the same instincts that once saved his life on the battlefield would soon be tested again, not in a faraway land, but right there at home. But for now, he took one last deep breath, patted Ranger's head, and said softly, "Good night, boy." The dog wagged his tail once, then followed him inside. The lights went out. The house fell silent. Outside, the rain began to fall again, gentle, steady, and calm, as if trying to protect the peace that both man and dog had worked so hard to find. The next morning started like any other day. The sun rose quietly, pushing through the thin fog that hung over the fields. John made coffee, opened the door, and watched Ranger trot out into the yard. The air was fresh, carrying the smell of wet soil from last night's rain. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of calm that felt like a gift. He sat on the porch, sipping slowly, thinking about the small things he wanted to get done that day. He needed to fix a loose step near the shed and maybe mow the tall grass by the fence. Ranger barked softly at a bird that landed too close, then looked back at John as if to ask for approval. John smiled. "It's just a bird, boy. Let it be." He didn't know that miles away, a call had gone out to the local police about a break-in on the other side of town. The dispatcher gave out the wrong house number, a small mistake that would change everything. While John went about his morning, a group of officers was getting ready to respond to what they believed was an active burglary in progress. They didn't know they were heading toward the wrong home. By noon, the day had grown warm. John finished mowing the grass and wiped his forehead with a towel. He decided to take a break and have lunch inside. Ranger lay by the door, his head resting on his paws, half asleep. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. It was one of those slow afternoons where time seemed to stretch. Around that same time, 2 patrol cars rolled quietly down the road that led to John's property. The officers scanned the area, checking their radios for updates. They had been told the suspect was armed and dangerous, hiding inside a rural house matching John's address by mistake. There was no reason for them to doubt it. John, unaware of any of this, stepped out again after lunch. He was fixing a small part of the fence when Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched, body tense. John noticed it immediately. Years of experience had trained him to read even the smallest signs of change. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Ranger didn't bark right away. He just stared toward the road, tail still, posture alert. Then came the faint sound of engines. John turned and saw the dust rising from the path. A pair of police vehicles were approaching fast. He frowned, confused. It wasn't common for police to come out this far unless there was trouble. He stood up, wiped his hands, and waited. The vehicles pulled up to the edge of his driveway. 4 officers stepped out, moving quickly and talking into their radios. Something about their movement felt off, tense, hurried, cautious. John could sense it right away. Ranger barked once, loud and deep. It wasn't aggression, just warning. John called out calmly, "Afternoon, officers. Everything all right?" But they didn't answer right away. One of them gestured toward him. Another moved to the side of the yard. The sudden shift in their tone made Ranger uneasy. He barked again, louder this time, stepping forward a few feet. John raised a hand. "Easy, boy," he said. The last thing he wanted was for the dog to startle them. The officer shouted something, short, sharp commands that John couldn't quite make out over the noise. He took a step forward, trying to speak clearly. "You've got the wrong place. There's no problem here." But they didn't seem to hear him. Their attention had shifted to Ranger, who was standing between them and his owner, protective but calm. John's heart started to pound. He could see their hands near their holsters, and that was enough to make him nervous. "Stay," he said firmly to Ranger. The dog froze in place, tail still wagging slightly, ears up. But the officers were already on edge. One of them muttered something quickly, voice tight with adrenaline. John recognized the look, fear mixed with uncertainty. He had seen it too many times before, in places where mistakes cost lives. He raised his hand slightly, trying to ease the tension. "Look," he said, voice steady. "This is my property. My name is John Keller. You must have the wrong address." The air felt heavy, too quiet for a moment. Ranger shifted his weight, glancing between John and the strangers. Then a loud noise in the distance, and maybe a car door slamming, maybe thunder, and startled him. He barked once, short but sharp. It was the sound that broke the thin thread of calm. Before John could move or speak, chaos took over. The moment felt stretched, slow, unreal. Ranger's bark echoed, the officers shouted, and John's instincts kicked in. He stepped forward, reaching out, shouting, "No!" But the world had already turned to noise. Radios, shouting, confusion. The seconds blurred together, and then silence. When the noise cleared, John stood frozen, staring at the spot where Ranger had been. The dog lay still on the grass, his body motionless. The sound that left John's throat wasn't a shout, wasn't a cry, yet it was something deeper, something hollow. He dropped to his knees beside Ranger, his hands shaking. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The officers were still shouting, still moving, still thinking they were in the middle of a dangerous situation. John couldn't even hear them anymore. His focus was on the dog, the one being that had never left his side, now gone in an instant. His chest felt heavy, his breath uneven. He touched Ranger's fur gently, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes already knew. When one of the officers finally realized the mistake, the energy shifted. "Wait, this isn't the right address," someone said. The words cut through the air like glass breaking. Radios buzzed, confusion spread, and then came the silence again. That terrible, unbearable silence. John slowly stood, his face pale, his eyes locked on the men before him. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, too calm. "You shot my dog," he said softly. No anger, no shouting, just quiet disbelief. The officers looked shaken, unsure what to say. One started to explain, stammering about a report, a misunderstanding, but John wasn't listening. He looked down at Ranger again, at the stillness where life had just been. The world felt distant, unreal. For years he had seen loss. Men he'd served with, friends who never made it home, but nothing had ever felt like this. This wasn't war. This was his home, his peace, his friend. One of the officers reached out as if to help, but John took a small step back. His eyes were steady now, the kind of steady that came from deep control. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "You need to leave." The senior officer hesitated, then nodded. They started to back away slowly, speaking into their radios again, voices low. John didn't move until they were gone. When the last car drove away, the sound of the tires on gravel faded into the wind. He knelt again beside Ranger, his hand resting on the dog's fur. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the yard. It was supposed to be another ordinary day. Instead, it had become the one day he would never forget. As the sky darkened, John stayed there, motionless, his thoughts drifting somewhere far away. He remembered the days overseas, the ones when loss came without warning, when one mistake could change everything. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was supposed to be safety, and somehow it still felt like war. Neighbors started to notice the flashing lights earlier and came by quietly after the police left. A few called out asking if he was okay, but John didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stayed there, sitting on the grass beside Ranger, lost in a silence that felt endless. Hours passed. The night air grew cold. Finally, John stood and gently carried Ranger to the porch. He wrapped him in a blanket, the same one he used on cold nights when they sat outside together. He didn't know what to do next. His hands were steady, but inside everything trembled. He went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. The cup of coffee from that morning was still there, cold now. He stared at it, not really seeing it. The house felt different, empty, too quiet. He could still hear the echoes of the chaos in his mind. The commands, the barking, the gunshots. Over and over they played like a broken record. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the windows. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, trying to steady himself. Years of discipline kept him from breaking completely. But that night, for the first time in a long time, John let the tears fall. Quietly, silently. No one saw. No one would ever know what it took for him to stay still, to breathe, to not fall apart completely. By midnight, the town had gone dark. The police cars were long gone. The mistake had been realized. Reports already being written somewhere by men who didn't know the man they had wronged. But for John, paperwork and apologies meant nothing. All he had left was the silence and the empty space by his side. He walked outside one last time before bed. The air was cool, stars scattered across the sky. He looked toward the field where Ranger used to run and whispered softly, "I'm sorry, boy." The wind carried the words away, soft and fragile. He stood there for a long time, staring into the night, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be found. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound made him sit up, heart racing. For years he had trained to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't something he could fix. It wasn't a mission. It was a loss that reached deeper than anything before. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, John finally drifted off in his chair, exhausted. The house was still, the world quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The morning after felt heavier than any day John could remember. The light came slowly through the window, soft and gray. He sat in his chair, the one by the window where Ranger used to curl up beside him. The house was quiet, too quiet. For years, John had learned to live with silence, but this silence was different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was empty. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same moment replaying again and again. The sound, the confusion, the stillness that followed. It wasn't something he could just shut off. He'd seen tragedy before, but this time it had come home. It wasn't war. It was something far more personal. He stood slowly, stretching stiff muscles, and walked to the porch. The air was cool, with a faint smell of rain still lingering from the night before. The yard looked the same, and the same trees, the same fence, the same patch of grass, but everything felt different now. His eyes fell on the spot where Ranger had been, and a wave of pain hit him again. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. For a long while, he just stood there. The world moved on around him. Birds chirped, a tractor rumbled in the distance, the wind brushed against the fields. But John stayed still. It was strange, he thought, how the world didn't stop for grief. Later that morning, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant. John hesitated before opening it. On the porch stood a young officer, not one of the men from yesterday. His face was nervous, eyes downcast. "Sir," he began quietly, "I'm very sorry for what happened yesterday. The department, they wanted me to come and check on you." John studied him for a long moment before replying. "You're not one of them," he said quietly. The officer shook his head. "No, sir." "Then you shouldn't be the one standing here," John said, his voice calm but firm. There was no anger, just exhaustion. The officer nodded, clearly unsure what to say next. "I understand, sir. I'll let them know you're okay." "I'm not okay," John said softly, "but you can tell them I'm breathing." The young man gave a small nod, then turned and left. John watched him go, feeling a mix of sadness and pity. He wasn't angry at that boy. He knew what fear looked like, what confusion could do. But still, the weight of it all pressed on him like a stone. For the rest of the day, John tried to keep himself busy. He fixed the loose step he had planned to repair, though his hands trembled slightly as he worked. It wasn't about the step. It was about keeping his mind from sinking too deep. The sound of the hammer hitting wood echoed through the quiet yard. It was something solid to hold on to even for a moment. Neighbors started stopping by through the day. They had seen the flashing lights yesterday and had heard bits and pieces from others. Most didn't know what to say. Some brought food, others offered kind words. John thanked them all politely, but his answers were short. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted understanding, something most people couldn't give. That evening, as the sun began to fall behind the trees, John sat on the porch again. The old blanket that used to belong to Ranger was folded neatly beside him. He reached over, picked it up, and held it for a long time. It still carried a faint scent, one that reminded him of long walks, warm nights, and quiet companionship. He let out a long breath. "You were a good one," he whispered. "The best." He sat there until it grew dark. He didn't cry this time. He just sat still, watching the sky shift from orange to blue to black. The stars began to appear one by one. Somewhere out there, people were still laughing, still living their normal lives. It almost felt strange to know that the world could keep spinning when his own had stopped. A few days later, a man from the police department came by. He was older, dressed neatly, the kind of man used to speaking carefully. "Mr. Keller," he began, "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened. It was a terrible mistake." John listened quietly, his face unreadable. The man continued, talking about internal reviews, procedures, and retraining. It all sounded like the kind of talk people used when they didn't know what else to say. Finally, John interrupted him. "You can't fix this with words," he said. "You can change your reports, your rules, your forms, but you can't undo what happened out there." The man lowered his eyes. "I know, but we can try to make sure it never happens again." John nodded slowly. "Then do that," he said. "Make sure no one else has to go through what I did." The man left soon after, his expression heavy. John closed the door and stood there for a moment, leaning against it. He didn't know if anything would change, but at least he had spoken his truth. In the days that followed, the story began to spread. A local news outlet picked it up, then a few online sites. People were outraged, shocked that such a mistake could happen. Some wanted justice, others wanted answers. But John didn't care about the noise. He didn't want to be a story. He just wanted peace again. One afternoon, while sitting in the diner, he overheard two men talking at the counter. "You hear about that guy out on County Road 12, one said. "They say he used to be some kind of special forces or something." The cops had no idea who they were dealing with. The other man shook his head. "Doesn't matter who he was. That was his dog." Shouldn't have happened. John didn't say a word. He just sipped his coffee quietly. He didn't want fame or pity, but hearing people care, even strangers, made something inside him shift. Maybe, he thought, some good could still come from the pain. That night he sat down and started writing. At first it was just a few words, then sentences, then pages. He wrote about discipline, about fear, about how small mistakes could destroy lives. He didn't write with anger. He wrote with the calmness of someone who had seen too much. The words flowed like water from a deep well, slow but steady. He didn't plan on sharing it, but writing helped. It was as if putting his thoughts on paper made the noise in his head quieter. Every night he would write a little more, sometimes about Ranger, sometimes about his service, sometimes just about the strange balance between peace and pain. Weeks passed. Slowly, life began to take shape again. He still woke early, still made coffee, still worked around the property. But something had changed inside him. He noticed things more. The way the light fell on the grass, the sound of the wind through the trees, the laughter of children down the road. Every small thing felt like a reminder to keep moving. One morning, a letter arrived. It was from a local animal rights group. They had heard about his story and wanted his permission to share it as part of a campaign for better police training. John read it twice, then set it down. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he nodded to himself. "If it helps someone else," he said softly, "then do it." He replied with a simple note of agreement. A few weeks later, he saw an article online. His story told simply, without exaggeration. It wasn't about blame, it was about change. And for the first time since that terrible day, John felt something close to peace. That evening, he went for a walk along the road. The air was warm, the sky painted with shades of gold and pink. As he walked, he felt a familiar ache, but it wasn't as sharp now. He stopped by the small wooden marker he had placed under the tree where Ranger used to rest. It wasn't fancy, just a small sign with one word carved into it. Loyal. He knelt there for a while, hands resting on his knees. "We did good, boy," he said quietly. "You kept me going. You always did." A soft wind brushed through the grass, and for a moment he almost thought he heard the faint sound of paws running nearby. It made him smile just a little. As the days turned into weeks, John started helping at the local shelter. It wasn't something he had planned. He went there one day to donate some supplies, but the people there asked if he wanted to volunteer. He agreed, and before long it became a regular thing. He helped fix kennels, build fences, and repair things around the property. The dogs there seemed to sense his calm presence. Some were scared or shy, but they warmed up to him quickly. There was one dog, a young shepherd mix, who reminded him of Ranger. At first he avoided getting too close. It felt strange, like he was trying to replace something that couldn't be replaced. But the dog had a quiet persistence, following him around as he worked. Eventually, John gave in. He started taking him on walks, talking to him softly. The dog responded with gentle eyes and wagging tail. He didn't name him right away. It took weeks before he finally said the words out loud. "Your buddy," he said one morning as they walked by the lake. The dog wagged his tail as if he understood perfectly. John smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. It felt like a new chapter beginning. Still, the memories of that day never fully faded. Sometimes when he heard sirens in the distance, his chest tightened. But he had learned to breathe through it. To remember that not every sound meant danger. To remember that peace was something you had to build piece by piece, even when the world tried to take it from you. Months later, John received a letter from the police department again. This time it wasn't an apology. It was an invitation. They wanted him to speak at a training session for new recruits, to talk about restraint, communication, and the human cost of mistakes. He thought about it for a long time before saying yes. When the day came, he stood in front of a room full of young officers. He didn't wear a suit or uniform, just jeans and a simple shirt. He looked at them quietly before speaking. "You'll be scared sometimes," he said. "You'll make decisions in seconds that will stay with you for years. But remember this. Every choice you make affects someone's life. Don't forget that." The room was silent. Every eye was on him. "I'm not here to blame anyone," he continued. "I'm here to remind you that behind every door, behind every face, there's a story you don't know. Don't let fear take that from you." When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then someone began to clap, and soon the whole room followed. John didn't smile much, but he nodded slightly. Maybe, just maybe, something good had come from the pain after all. That evening, he drove home as the sun dipped low on the horizon. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, enjoying the breeze. John looked at him and said softly, "Let's go home." And as the road stretched ahead, lined with golden light for the first time in a long while, John felt at peace again. The morning sun broke through the clouds slowly, painting the town in soft gold. It had been months since the day everything changed, but for John, the echoes still lingered. The air was calmer now, quieter. The ache in his heart hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, shaped by time and the quiet rhythm of healing. Each day felt like another step forward, even if the steps were small. The story of what had happened had spread far beyond the small town. Reporters had come and gone, leaving behind headlines and news clips that told only fragments of the truth. To the public, John had become a symbol, the quiet veteran who lost his companion to a mistake. But to the people who knew him, he was still the same man who fixed fences, helped at the shelter, and waved politely to neighbors. He didn't live for attention. He just lived. The police department had gone through a storm of public criticism. Protests were held, meetings filled with angry citizens demanding change. The town that had always seemed peaceful was now forced to face uncomfortable questions. Training programs were restructured, procedures rewritten. It was slow work, but change was finally happening. John never attended those meetings, but he read about them in the papers, and each time he nodded quietly to himself. Maybe, just maybe, it was working. Buddy, the shepherd mix he'd adopted, had become his shadow. Wherever John went, Buddy followed, to the workshop, to the fields, even to town. The bond between them grew quietly, built on trust rather than need. Buddy was different from Ranger, but in some ways he filled the silence that used to haunt the house. John didn't talk much, but when he did, it was often to Buddy. The dog listened, head tilted, as if he understood every word. One afternoon, John received a letter in the mail. It was stamped with the city seal, another message from the department. He set it on the table, unsure whether to open it right away. For a while, he just stared at it, sipping his coffee. Finally, he tore the envelope open. Inside was a simple invitation. They wanted him to attend a public forum, a meeting where citizens could speak directly to law enforcement about their concerns. John read it twice. He wasn't sure if he wanted to go. He had said his piece before, but something inside him stirred, a quiet feeling that maybe his presence could mean something more. He folded the letter and set it aside, telling himself he'd think about it. That night he sat on the porch as the wind moved softly through the trees. The sky was clear, full of stars. Buddy lay at his feet, half asleep. John leaned back and thought about everything that had happened. Not just the loss, but the people he'd met since. The shelter workers, the letters from strangers who had written to say his story had changed how they saw things. Even a few officers who had reached out to apologize personally. It was strange how tragedy could bring out both the worst and the best in people. He decided to go. The day of the forum arrived, and the town hall was already full when John walked in. People whispered when they saw him. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked at him with quiet admiration. He didn't like the attention, but he understood it. He took a seat in the back row, hands folded on his lap. The chief of police stood at the front, speaking about reforms and accountability. There was tension in the room, but there was also hope. When the time came for citizens to speak, a few people stood up, business owners, parents, community members, all sharing their fears and frustrations. Then, after a moment of hesitation, John stood too. The room fell silent almost instantly. Everyone knew who he was. He walked to the microphone slowly, his posture calm and steady. "Most of you know me," he began softly, "and you know what happened." His voice carried the kind of quiet strength that made people listen. "I'm not here to point fingers. I've done enough of that in my head already. I'm here to talk about what comes next." He paused, looking around the room. "We can't go back and change that day. But we can change how we move forward. Mistakes happen, and they always will. But how we handle them defines who we are. What I want is simple: understanding, patience, and respect." "That's not too much to ask." A murmur ran through the crowd. John continued, "I've seen fear. I've seen what it does to people. It makes them act before they think. That's what happened that day. Fear. But the answer to fear isn't more power. It's training. It's empathy. It's remembering that every life, human or animal, matters." His words hung in the air for a long moment before he nodded once and stepped away. The room erupted into quiet applause. Not loud or dramatic, and just genuine. The kind that came from hearts moved by truth. After the meeting, several people came up to thank him. Some shook his hand, others simply said, "We're with you." One of the officers, a young woman with kind eyes, approached him and said quietly, "Your words will stay with us. Thank you." John gave a small nod. "Just remember what you said," he replied. "That's all I ask." That night he drove home in silence. Buddy's head rested on his lap as the truck hummed along the quiet road. The stars above looked brighter than usual. He didn't know if his words would truly change anything, but he felt lighter than he had in months. The weeks that followed brought more change. The town council passed a new policy requiring officers to undergo mandatory empathy and communication training. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and though John never took credit, many people knew his voice had helped make it happen. Life returned to a calm rhythm again. John spent his mornings at the shelter, his afternoons fixing things around the house, and his evenings walking Buddy along the edge of the lake. Sometimes local kids would wave as he passed, and he'd smile and wave back. The world didn't feel as heavy anymore. One afternoon, as he was repairing a fence post near the edge of his property, a car pulled up by the gate. A man stepped out, tall in plain clothes with a hesitant expression. John recognized him immediately. He was one of the officers from that night. For a moment, neither spoke. The man finally said, "I wasn't sure if I should come." John stood quietly, leaning against the post. "You came," he said. "That's something." The officer nodded slowly. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I've said it to the department, to everyone else, but not to you. I've thought about that night every day. I wish I could take it back." John looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "I believe you." The officer's shoulders dropped slightly as if a weight had lifted. "Thank you," he said quietly. John turned back to his work. "You can't change what happened," he said, hammering a nail into place. "But you can make sure it never happens again. That's what matters." The man nodded again, his voice rough. "I'm trying." John gave a small smile. "Then keep trying." The officer left soon after. As the car disappeared down the road, John stood there for a long time, feeling something he hadn't felt in a while. Closure. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was necessary. That evening, he sat on the porch again, Buddy lying beside him. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees. John thought about everything: the pain, the healing, the small steps that had led him here. Life was far from perfect, but it was honest. And sometimes that was enough. Months later, he received another letter, this time from a national news outlet. They wanted to feature his story in a special about community healing. John smiled faintly as he read it. He didn't crave the spotlight, but he knew stories like his could help others. After thinking for a day, he agreed. When the crew arrived, they set up cameras around his porch. The interviewer asked gentle questions about Ranger, about forgiveness, about what peace meant to him now. John answered simply, his words quiet but steady. "Peace," he said, "isn't something you find. It's something you build, one day, one choice at a time." The interview aired a few weeks later, and letters began to pour in from across the country. People shared their own stories of loss, regret, and healing. John read each one slowly, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with tears. He replied to many of them, writing short, honest messages of hope. "You're stronger than you think," he often wrote. "Keep going." In time, the noise faded again. Reporters moved on. The town settled, and life returned to its steady pace. But the changes stayed. The department kept its promise. New officers were trained differently, with empathy at the heart of their lessons. And sometimes John was invited to speak again, not as a symbol of pain, but as a teacher of perspective. One evening, as John sat by the lake, Buddy resting his head on his knee, he looked out over the water and thought about how far he had come. The grief was still there, but it no longer ruled him. In its place was something gentler, acceptance. The kind that comes only after you've lived through the storm and learned to stand again. He picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the lake. Ripples spread across the surface, catching the last light of day. "We did all right, didn't we, Buddy?" he said quietly. The dog wagged his tail in response. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, John sat there a little longer, breathing in the calm. He didn't need headlines or praise or even forgiveness anymore. What he needed, Mike, and finally had, was peace. And that was enough. The seasons had turned again, and the hills around the small town were alive with color. Autumn leaves fell in slow spirals, painting the ground in warm shades of gold and red. For John, it marked another year, another quiet chapter in a life that had finally found its rhythm. The past still lived somewhere in his heart, but it no longer weighed him down. It was simply part of who he was. He had grown used to the steady pace of his days. Morning walks with Buddy, afternoons spent working on small carpentry projects, and evenings on the porch watching the sun go down. It was the kind of peace he had once thought he'd never know again. Sometimes, when he looked out over the lake, he could almost feel Ranger's spirit nearby. Not as a painful memory, but as a gentle reminder that love doesn't vanish. It simply changes form. One crisp morning, a letter arrived in the mail, not from the department this time, but from a local school. The teacher explained that her students had learned about John's story through the community project on kindness and empathy. They wanted him to come and speak about what he'd learned from his experiences. He smiled softly at the idea. Kids, he thought, had the kind of curiosity that made the world better. After a few days of thinking, he decided to say yes. The day of the visit came quickly. The school was small and full of laughter, the kind that echoed down the hallways and made the walls seem alive. The children gathered in the library, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Some held notebooks, others just stared wide-eyed at the man they had only heard about in stories. John felt a bit out of place, but as soon as Buddy padded in beside him, the room filled with smiles. He started talking softly, his voice carrying warmth rather than authority. "You know," he said, "sometimes life surprises you. Sometimes it hurts you too. But the important thing is what you do next." He told them about courage, about mistakes, and about the power of forgiveness, not just for others, but for yourself. The children listened quietly, their young faces full of thought. When he finished, a small hand went up. "Did you ever stop being sad?" a little boy asked. John smiled, his eyes kind. "No," he said softly. "But sadness changes. It doesn't always hurt the same way. One day it becomes something gentler. It becomes a way to remember the good things." The boy nodded slowly, and the room stayed quiet for a long time before the teacher thanked him. When John left the school that day, he felt lighter again. It wasn't the kind of joy that came from excitement. It was something deeper, like calm water after a storm. The teacher handed him a bundle of drawings the children had made, pictures of dogs, hearts and words like hope and kindness. He placed them carefully in his truck, feeling humbled. Days turned into weeks and the quiet rhythm continued. But one evening, as he and Buddy walked along the lake, a familiar sound reached him, the hum of a drone. He looked up and saw it hovering above the trees. It reminded him of the reporters from before, but when he returned home, he found out it wasn't from the media at all. A filmmaker had been capturing stories of everyday heroes, people who had turned pain into purpose. They wanted to include him in their next documentary. John hesitated at first. He didn't see himself as a hero, but after talking it over with a few people from the shelter, he realized it wasn't about him. It was about showing others that healing was possible. So once again, he said yes. When the crew arrived, they were gentle and respectful. They filmed John working in his shop, walking with Buddy and talking about his journey. "I don't think of myself as someone special," he told them. "I just kept moving forward. That's all anyone can do." They also filmed at the shelter where John had become something of a mentor. Many of the younger volunteers looked up to him, not for what he had done, but for the calm way he carried himself. After the filming ended, the director shook his hand and said, "People need to hear your story. It's not about tragedy, It's about what comes after. Months later, when the documentary aired, it touched hearts far beyond the town. Letters arrived again, this time from across the country and even from overseas. People wrote about their own struggles, about losing someone, about trying to forgive. John read them all, sometimes sitting up late into the night. He replied when he could, always writing from the heart. You can't rush healing, he often wrote. You just have to show up for it. Every day. The attention brought new visitors to town, journalists, students, even a few officers from other departments who wanted to learn from the program his case had inspired. John welcomed them kindly, sharing his story without bitterness. Over time, his home became a quiet place of reflection, a spot where others came to listen and learn. Despite the changes around him, John never lost touch with the simple life he loved. He still volunteered at the shelter, taught young volunteers how to train and care for dogs, and built small wooden toys for the local children. His hands were never idle, and his heart, once cracked with grief, was now strong again. One afternoon, while fixing a door at the shelter, the director approached him with an idea. We're planning to name our new community room after you, she said with a smile. You've done more for this town than you know. John shook his head gently. You don't need to do that, he said. I just did what anyone should do. The director smiled wider. Maybe so, but not everyone does it. A few weeks later, the sign went up. The Hope Room. Not his name, but the meaning behind it. That was enough for him. The room became a safe space for anyone struggling, a place where people could talk, listen, and heal together. One winter morning, John woke early and stepped outside to find the first snow falling. The world was quiet, wrapped in white. Buddy bounded through the snow, leaving small prints behind. John smiled, pulling his coat tighter. Snow used to remind him of loneliness, but now it reminded him of peace, of a world being gently covered, renewed. Later that day, he sat by the fire with a cup of tea, looking at a photo on the mantel. It was of Ranger sitting proudly beside him years ago. Next to it was another photo, of Buddy, tongue out, eyes bright. 2 chapters of the same story. He realized then that loss doesn't end a story. It just changes its shape. That evening, as the snow continued to fall, John began writing something in a notebook. Not for anyone else, just for himself. He wrote about the lessons he had learned, about forgiveness, patience, and the quiet strength of moving forward. His handwriting was slow and careful, his words simple. Peace, he wrote, isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without breaking. Over the next few months, his writings grew into something more. Short reflections on life, healing, and love. With encouragement from friends, he decided to publish them in a small collection. The book, titled Quiet Steps, became a quiet success. Readers from all walks of life found comfort in his words. Many wrote to thank him, saying his book had helped them through their hardest days. For John, it wasn't about fame or praise. It was about giving something back, a way to honor Ranger's memory and everything the journey had taught him. Years passed quietly. The town grew, new faces arrived, and the community flourished. The police program he had inspired became part of the state's training system. Every year, officers came to the town for workshops, learning about compassion and communication. John was often invited to speak at the closing sessions. He always ended his talks the same way. You don't have to be perfect. Just be human. That's where understanding begins. Buddy grew older, his muzzle turning gray, but his spirit never faded. John cared for him with the same devotion he had shown from the start. They grew old together, 2 souls who had helped each other heal. One spring morning, as the sun rose over the hills, John walked down to the lake once more. The water shimmered, the air filled with the scent of fresh grass. He sat on the familiar rock and took a deep breath. He thought about everything. The pain, the growth, the countless small moments that had led him here. Life had been hard, but it had also been beautiful, he whispered. Thank you. Though he wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to the world, maybe to Ranger, maybe just to time itself. Buddy sat beside him, leaning gently against his leg. The old dog sighed, content and calm. John smiled and looked out across the lake. The ripples danced like light itself, alive and free. He knew now that peace wasn't a destination. It was a